going to be moderating this meeting tonight, and I want to thank all of you for coming out, and especially for having us in this beautiful venue. I can't believe you get to have this every day. It's gorgeous. I want to just say a couple things here. This is the Ford Aeroneutronics public meeting for the Water Board, and we're here tonight to discuss the draft cleanup plan or draft feasibility study remedial action plan. So that's how Ford is proposing to address contamination at the site, and Jessica Law will be talking about that. A couple things before we get into it. I think everybody got a handout, if I'm not mistaken. So if you didn't, raise your hand, and Sarah will bring you one. We're recording this, so because we want to be able to put it on the website for folks that didn't come tonight. So I just want you to be aware you're being recorded. If for some reason you don't want to be recorded, let us know at the question and answer time, and we'll do something. We'll cut it out or edit it out, I think is what we can do. We have a short presentation tonight followed by questions and answers. I think everybody kind of knows the drill that we go through. And if you have questions, I would prefer, if you could, to write them down, and Sarah will collect them, and then we'll read them out so everybody can hear them, and it's more of a group experience with questions and answers. Does that sound good?
Yep.
Okay, then I think you know everybody here, but I'm going to go ahead and have Jessica, you introduce yourself first, then Mike, then Daniela, and then we'll get into the presentation. And if you can't hear us, because this is kind of a little bit different than what we normally do, let us know and we'll talk louder, or if we need to repeat something, just holler at us. Okay? Super.
All right. Hi, I'm Jessica Law with the Santa Ana Water Board, and I'm the case manager overseeing the environmental cleanup activities and assessment.
My name is Mike Barnes. I'm with Wood Environment and Infrastructure, and I'm the project manager, and Wood represents a Ford Motor Company.
My name is Daniela Hammond-Nazaroff. I'm an engineer with Wood, and I'm helping run the engineering side of things for this project.
There's just two things I forgot to tell you. I think you all know where the restrooms are, but in case you don't, they're down here. And I also just wanted to say Mike might have to leave a little bit early tonight. He has a family thing that he has to get to, so I think he's probably going to skip out about 7:15 or so. All right?
Okay.
Take it away.
All right, so I'm going to start on in the handout, and I will try to remember. But I'm on slide 4, which is just going over the presentation outline. So first, I just want to kind of go over a brief recap of what's occurred at the site. Then we'll talk about the remediation process. Then I'll start talking about the remedial action objectives, what that is, followed by the feasibility study. Then we'll discuss the remedial action plan and the recommended remedial alternatives. And then I'll cover the public comment period, what that entails, and what the next steps are. And then we will end the presentation with a Q&A session and kind of a follow-up presentation by Wood to go into more detail about the proposed soil vapor extraction system. So the next slide, slide 5, just to go over the recap of events that have occurred. The vapor intrusion assessment activities have been conducted over the last couple of years, and that has collected a sufficient number of data, and that data is used to conduct the human health risk assessment for the Belcourt Terrace community, and that's what we had a meeting on a few months ago to discuss. Conclusions from that risk assessment. It identified two things. One, that vapor intrusion is occurring at a few properties, and that was based on those indoor air samples that have been collected. And then the second was there's the potential for future risk, and that was the need for some additional longer-term indoor air sampling. So from that review, we requested 2 reports. First is that feasibility study and remedial action plan, and that's what we're here tonight to discuss. And then that longer-term indoor air monitoring plan. And Wood submitted the draft FSRAP on May 21st, and the Water Board provided comments on August 30th. And I know all of the Water Board comments do get addressed in the final FSRAP. So for the next slide, we're on slide 6. just want to go over the remediation process. So before we really dive into that draft FSRAP, want to take a moment to discuss kind of what happens. So first we have the site investigation, because before a site can go into remediation, or also referred to as cleanup, we do need to know the extent of the contamination, and this does include the field activities that's been occurring. So for this site, that's that soil gas, groundwater, and indoor air sampling that's been occurring over the last couple of years. The data, it is needed to put into that risk assessment report to determine if a site requires cleanup, if there's additional monitoring that's necessary, more assessment, or if no additional activities are needed at that time. So the next is that remedial action plan, and that process just develops and evaluates the cleanup alternatives, which includes one or more remedial technologies for each alternative. And that is determined based on selected criteria. And I will talk about what the criteria is later on in the presentation. Next is there's the regulatory agency for those remedial alternatives. The regulatory agency, so the Water Board, can accept the recommendation as it is, or with comments, or sometimes, we reject remedial alternatives altogether. But once it is approved, comes that public comment period step. So the public comment period is where we are now, and it's 30 days is typical, and that's when the proposed remedy is announced, and it provides an opportunity for public input, which is why we're here tonight. And I'm going to talk about that process towards the end of this presentation. And then next would be the remedial design. That step takes about 6 months to a year, and it does include the remedial design and implementation plan, which does get submitted to the Water Board for our approval, as well as securing any kind of necessary permits. And then we get into the remedy implementation step, and that includes the safe implementation of the remedy, as well as the operation and maintenance of the remedy, which does include regular monitoring. And it is important to note that the duration of this can vary, just kind of depending on weather, permitting, and other factors. So on the next slide is just we want to kind of transition over to the draft feasibility study and remedial action plan report that was submitted. So again, that's referred to as the draft FSRAP. And the FSRAP covered the following items, and I'm going to go into more detail on each of these in the coming slides. But it discusses the proposed specific remedial action objectives, conducted a feasibility study to evaluate the remedial technologies. It identified and evaluated remedial alternatives based on the feasibility study, and proposed a remedial alternative for the Water Board approval and for public review and comment. So on the next slide, we'll start talking about the remedial action objectives. And this is also referred to as RAOs. And I also mention our comments as well. So the remedial action objectives are the goals of the cleanup activities, and it does address each impacted media, being groundwater, soil gas, and indoor air. So the RAOs can be a numerical value, but are often descriptive criteria that are protective of human health and the environment. The FSRAP did not propose an RAO for groundwater, and it provided justification for not doing so. However, the Water Board did not concur with the justification and noted that RAOs need to be established in our response letter. And it is kind of important to note, though, that while the contaminated groundwater is not significant, it does appear to be the source of the soil gas plume, so we do want to address that in the remedial action objectives. Next is soil, and again, the FSRAP did not propose an RAO for soil, and it did provide justification, and again, the Water Board did not concur with that justification and noted that RAOs do need to be established in our response letter. But here it's important to note that historical sampling results didn't find any contaminated soil above screening levels, but that historical soil sampling over here was a little bit more limited. So we do want to have those RAOs established for any future drilling and sampling that may occur. Next is soil gas, and the FSRAP proposed using site-specific screening levels that were developed using the data that was collected from the site, from Belcourt Terrace community. And there's been a lot of data collected, and site-specific screening levels are good for some uses, but the Water Board did not concur with it as a cleanup goal. And so we didn't concur with it. We made some comments and did request more conservative screening levels to be used. And we've had conversations with Wood and Ford about that, just to explain our reasoning, what we are looking for, and that's getting addressed. And then finally was the indoor air RAOs, which the FSRAP recommended using the indoor air ESLs, and we did concur with that. And as I mentioned a couple slides ago, the Water Board comments, including those regarding the RAOs, will be addressed within the final FSRAP. So now I'm on slide 9. We'll talk about the feasibility study. And that's the next kind of big thing in the draft FSRAP. And the feasibility study just evaluates the different remedial technologies on the following criteria: the ability to implement, the effectiveness, and the cost. And the feasibility study evaluated over 20 different remedial technologies for cleaning up soil, soil gas, groundwater, and indoor air. And at the end of their analysis, 7 remedial technologies were retained because they were determined to be feasible to implement. So on the next slide, goes over the remedial alternatives that were considered. So following that feasibility study, potential remedial alternatives are developed from those retained remedial technologies. And a remedial alternative is just one or more remedial technologies that are proposed to meet the remedial action objectives or the cleanup goals. And the remedial alternatives that were proposed are as follows. There is alternative 1, which is no action. And I want to mention that all remedial action plans have a remedial alternative of no action for comparison purposes. Next is alternative 2. That included groundwater extraction, soil vapor extraction, enhanced HVAC systems for homes, land use controls and engineering controls to prevent the use of groundwater for domestic use. And then finally was alternative 3, and that included monitored natural attenuation for groundwater, soil vapor extraction, subslab depressurization, air purifiers, and again, those land use controls to prevent use of groundwater for domestic supply. And I'm going to talk more on what each of those are in a little bit. But on the next slide, I want to talk about what those remedial alternatives are compared to, which is the National Contingencies Plan's 9 evaluation criteria, which categorizes it into 3 different groups. There's the threshold criteria, the primary balancing criteria, and the modifying criteria. Now, all of the threshold criteria that's listed there must be satisfied for a remedial alternative to be considered. Therefore, the remedial alternative must be protective of human health and the environment, and it must comply with state and federal requirements. So as a result, this is usually when alternative 1 gets tossed out as an option. And next is the primary balancing criteria. And these 5 criteria are used to weigh the major trade-offs among the alternatives. And those include the long-term effectiveness and permanence, reduction of toxicity, mobility, and volume through treatment, the short-term effectiveness, implementability, and cost. And then finally is the modifying criteria, and that addresses the regulatory and public acceptance of the alternatives and community input input is especially important to the water board, and it is mentioned in the statutes regarding environmental cleanup. So we do appreciate your comments if you have any, and do consider them. So the next slide, I'm on slide 12. So based on the evaluation criteria, alternative 3 was recommended within that draft FSRAP for the water board's approval and to be presented here to the Belcourt Terrace community for public comment. So I'm going to discuss alternative 3 in more detail on the next slide. But first, you're going to notice that the bottom 3 activities are crossed out. And that's just because on our review, we noted that both enhanced HVAC and air purifiers are short-term mitigation measures for addressing vapor intrusion. And so it's not acceptable as a long-term remedy. And we noted that in our comment letter. Also, we know air purifiers, they've already been approved and offered to any homes that have had indoor air exceedances, and the general feedback has been getting them returned and not liking them because they are noisy. So it was something that wasn't going to be acceptable to the community anyway, so we addressed that in the letter. And then the final item that's crossed out is the land use controls with restricting the use of groundwater beneath Belcourt Terrace community for domestic supply. And that's not an option that's acceptable to the water board just because we consider all groundwater in the area to have beneficial uses regardless of depth. And we don't want to put a restriction on that. So that was that. Next slide, 13. Okay, so the proposed remedy recommended in the FSRAP was that alternative 3, and that includes groundwater cleanup by monitored natural attenuation. So this allows the natural ongoing processes to decrease groundwater concentrations. It's not an active remediation, but there is monitoring of groundwater concentrations to ensure they are decreasing. And in order to properly monitor the plume, some additional groundwater monitoring wells would need to be installed. Next is soil vapor extraction. And soil vapors are extracted from below the ground and are treated above ground prior to being discharged to the atmosphere. And it's similar to what occurred at the pilot test across this, the community over at Bay Ridge Park. And then there was subslab depressurization. So the subslab depressurization, that creates a negative pressure beneath the foundation of a building, and it redirects the vapors to above the roof line. And ideally, we want to start with cleanup with the soil vapor extraction system and have subslab depressurization as an alternative and kind of a contingency plan. But based on scheduling, timing, and to get just the SVE system up and running, if it can't happen fast enough, it may be necessary to start with subslab depressurization, though for here, and based on the indoor air results and the concentrations we have seen, it doesn't look like we do need to take that step, and just starting with SVE would be the most appropriate path forward. And so these are, though, just the considerations that are currently being evaluated. So on slide 14 shows a proposed conceptual soil vapor extraction layout. And the green circles are the locations of the soil vapor extraction wells, and they are placed in very specific locations based on data collected from the pilot test. And the black lines is where the underground piping would be that's connected to the wells and does run to the SVE system. And at the conclusion of my presentation, Wood is going to discuss this in more detail, and that would be a great time to ask any of those questions you may have about what the soil vapor extraction system might look like. And the proposed areas to be addressed by soil vapor extraction is based on a combination of current and future risk results from the risk assessment reports. And I want to emphasize that for this figure here, that's only a conceptual plan, and is not what the final design is going to be. We had met with a couple of the board members a few months ago and have already gotten some feedback, and so some changes have already occurred to this conceptual plan. So I just wanted to mention that. But the final remedial design is going to be presented in a remedial design and implementation plan, and that comes after the submittal of the final FSRAP. And again, I'll discuss those steps towards the end. And Ford and Wood are going to work very closely with Belcourt Terrace community to make sure that remedial design and implementation plan meets everyone's standards and everyone has concurrence on it before that design is submitted to the water board for approval. So then the next slide, 15, that would be the public comment period, which is just the time to allow, give an opportunity for public input to the proposed remedy prior to finalizing the FSRAP. And I do want to point out, again, that the conceptual plan I showed on that previous slide does include the couple of yellow squares showed it in like parking spaces and stuff like that. We know that is not desirable, and that the system location has already been adjusted based on comments received, but we do want to hear from you, any comments you may have. So the public comment period is from September 15th. Oh, sorry, next slide. The public comment period is from September 15th through October 14th. And at the end of the Q&A session, we will take any comments from you guys as well. And you can submit your comments to me anytime up until October 14th, either by email at jessica.law@waterboards.ca.gov, or my office address is there as well. So we are taking comments either way. You can mail them or email them, and my contact info is on this slide. And then the next slide, slide 17, kind of the next steps. So based on starting with cleanup, provided that the schedule is satisfactory and works, first is finalizing the FSRAP and preparing a responsiveness summary to address any comments received. So any comments that you guys send us, we will prepare a response to comments and address your comments in that letter and send that back to you guys. And it'll be included in the final FSRAP as well. Next will be the water board approval of the final FSRAP. And that approval will request the preparation and submittal of a remedial design and implementation plan. And I want to mention that Ford and Wood, again, will be communicating and coordinating that plan with Belcourt Terrace. The RDIP will then be submitted to the water board for approval, which we will review and provide comments on. And then the next step is permitting, equipment procurement, and construction of the soil vapor extraction system, and then startup of the SVE system. And it is anticipated that that system will operate for about 12 months, and that's based on the concentrations that have been detected. So we anticipate that it's going to be pretty quick or a short time to operate that system. And then for the next slide, it's the usual where you can get additional information. You have my contact info, but you can also go on to GeoTracker, which is the state's database where all of the reports are uploaded. LIRIS list for email notifications, and that one we use for the larger public meetings. The water board also has a web page that just has some of the key items from this project. And then Ford has developed a site-specific website as well as an 800 number to get additional information. And then there's the local information repository at the library. So then the last page is where we can kick it off to the Q&A session, and I can turn it over to Daniela to talk about the soil vapor extraction system kind of plan if you guys are interested in going over that.
Can I just get a show of hands that wants to go over that first before we get to questions and answers?
course, the lawyer.
Yeah,
Is this-
okay.
This is 5 minutes or 50 minutes?
Pardon me?
I'll make it 1 minute. All right, so for the soil vapor extraction plan, and you can keep looking at sort of this, it's essentially a vacuum system that works by kind of sucking out the impacted vapors from below the ground. So what we're showing here on those green dots, I think there's like 14 or 15 there, those are the wells. That's where the vacuum extraction is happening. It'll all be underground, so once they're installed, all you will see is sort of like a manhole cover, like you see, you know, for water or sewer or whatever in the street. There's underground piping that will bring all of those vapors to a treatment system, and we've already received feedback that the 3 systems that we are showing here, those little yellow squares, take up too much parking, and we're going to take that into consideration and consider consolidating down to 1 system to make less of a physical footprint and impact parking less. In that system, the treatment system will then process those vapors to clean them up, and the way that's done is through granular activated carbon. It's sort of like what's in your Brita filter, and what it does is the contaminants stick onto that, and then what comes out is clean air. That system will have some, you know, impacts in terms of, you know, there's a blower, which is the mechanism by which the vacuum's created. That can be noisy, and we know that that's going to be one of the biggest concerns. So our top priority is to design something that will be quiet and will have low impact. We also know it's sort of an impact visually, aesthetics. So that's another one of our top concerns, would be to enclose that structure, that the treatment system, in a structure that's going to match the architecture that's already here. So it'll look like a small building, but, you know, in terms of trim and look, we want it to look, you know, pleasing, and we definitely want to take that into consideration since it is going to be in your guys' neighborhood. Anything else I'm missing? Quick overview?
I would say for the purpose of the trenching that'll be done, as we did a site walk with one of our other engineers, we determined that most of the digging we'll have to do by hand. So that'll be a crew literally with shovels doing the trenching. And that's a benefit in that it'll be a little bit less noise as far as heavy equipment in the area. But yeah, that pretty much sums it up. I would say probably 18 inches.
Yeah, I mean, we don't need to go very deep. It'll just be sort of what the city requires in terms of clearance.
Now the extraction wells, though, those go to 25 and 40 feet roughly, something like that. But that's vertically. Everything that's horizontal, that'll just be below the surface about 18 inches. With an 18-inch wide trench, that'll then be backfilled. Any vegetation that's being disturbed will be replaced. Our goal is to make it look like it did, if not better, when we walk away.
And so the wells are that deep, so they'll be drilled.
The wells,
Correct.
yeah.
Yeah, so a
Mike?
similar rig that you've seen out here installing the soil gas probes will be used.
Mike, I'm going to have you repeat the questions if they're thrown at you, simply because we're recording. Okay.
So the question was, the vertical extraction wells will be drilled, and that is, the answer is yes, they'll be drilled using a drill rig, similar to what's been in the community previously.
All right, I think we are going to open this up for questions and answers, and I just want to remind you we're in the middle of the public comment period, September 15th to October 14th, and we'd like to start this with just clarifying questions. Questions last 15 minutes. We'll actually take those public comments of your input in this into this plan, and all of those comments will be wrapped up into what's called a responsiveness summary. That's going to be a water board document. They're going to look at all the comments, review them before making any final decision on the cleanup plan, and that document will state how they were considered in making a final decision for the plan. So I think just because of COVID, I'm wondering if we could write questions and you could give them to me, or I can come over and repeat them. So tell me what works for you.
Can we come over and repeat them?
Yeah, I got.
Because,
I can come over here. Sure.
I don't know if everyone has a pen. We
That's
don't.
fine. So who has a comment? I'm just going to question. I'm going to number you just to make it easy. So 1.
We're one.
You're 1. Oh, you're 1. Okay, they're 1. 2. Who else? Okay, so behind you 3, and then 4. Why don't we start there?
Okay, actually, I have two questions.
Fine.
The first question is,
Yeah, I'm gonna let you.
Okay.
There you go.
in the yellow squares, those are called,
He's talking about
the
that.
yellow squares on the, page 19, are those gonna be what?
Those are what were the proposed treatment system compounds, and instead of 3, now we're looking at 1. And the location of the 1 is sort of similar. How do I describe this since it's all on Hillsdale? It's on it's actually like right, the parking that's right there.
Yes,
So it wouldn't actually be in that parking space. We would leave
Correct.
the parking. It's in the hillside kind of vegetated area. We would essentially carve out some space in that vegetated area, put up a retaining wall and place the compound there.
okay, and that's gonna be flat, or is that gonna be the building?
That would be the building.
So you have that designated for out here?
That's what we're currently, based on conversations with the HOA board and feedback, that's sort of the best
So
option.
there would only be one?
So there would only be 1, so those other yellow squares would disappear.
Okay, and then the green dots are going to be where we would hear them, because,
No, so at the green dots, you wouldn't hear any sound, because it's happening like way down
Oh, well,
below.
where's the sound?
The sound is in the yellow square
Okay.
at the treatment
And
system.
just one?
Just 1,
Okay.
correct.
But I do want to stress that the sound, based on the engineering controls that we'll be using, will be mitigated. I don't want to say you won't hear it, but you'd have to be pretty close to it. I don't think any of the homes surrounding it, unless it was dead silent and you were really trying to hear it, I think you'd be okay.
Okay.
Yeah, number one concern is noise for us on this.
And isn't it, Daniela, once all the soundproofing and stuff is done, isn't it gonna be comparable to the pool equipment here as far as sound?
That's what we're hoping.
Just
Mike,
to,
Mike, I think we talked about in our meeting, all of this is subject to engineering, but potentially you would look at operating it during business hours rather than 24/7.
I'm gonna I just wanna make sure we capture this question. So the question was, you'd be operating this during business hours primarily?
Potentially.
Potentially. The idea is to run the system to be most effective 24 hours a day.
Right.
However, some factors could come into play that would allow us or require us to pulse the system, meaning run it during the day only. Noise complaints would be one of those. We hope to mitigate that and not have that as a potential. And then the effectiveness of the system, how much mass we're pulling out, could result ultimately in a pulsing type system.
Thank you.
This building will be how tall, how big, what color?
It's still to be determined, but to give you a sense, the granular activated carbon vessels, that's going to probably be the limiting or the deciding factor in terms of height. And typically these vessels can be like 8 feet tall. So in order to sort of enclose that and make sure it's not visible, it may require like a 9-foot wall. Again, at the proposed location that we're looking at, it's a hillside. So digging into that hillside, it will not look as tall to the eye because the hillside will rise up around it. But yeah, we're looking at a 9 or 10-foot structure.
So the structure wouldn't be more than a one-story building, but there is a stack that will continue, I think, 15 feet from the ground surface, and that's just the discharge. It's just a small chimney that we have to extend a certain height above the ground to discharge the treated.
And what color?
We'll work with the HOA to determine what color that is within
Not
the CC&Rs.
bright purple?
Nope, it'll be whichever. I see there's about 4 different colors you're all able to choose from. It'll be one of those.
Okay.
Yep.
And I'm confused. You said we have a comment period from 9:15, which is already passed, until 10:14. What is it? Is there something that we're supposed to have gotten or will be getting that we're to comment on? I don't know what I'm supposed to read and comment on.
so the comment would be, you'd be commenting on the draft feasibility study and remedial action plan. A community fact sheet was sent out that announced the start of the public comment period. That document is available on GeoTracker as well as the website Ford created. And those links are in that community fact sheet. And I know that there are handouts that'll show that where you can access it as well.
And to give you an example, because we just went through the public comment period with Bay Ridge Park, typically, I mean, I think one of the #1 comments that we got was, we don't want you taking our parking spots. So it's things like that, things that you may see inconveniencing you as a homeowner, that we would take into consideration, and ultimately Jessica would respond in a comment that's included in the final FSRAP as the responsiveness summary.
And also, just so you know, like, we have different, you know, projects, and we get just individualized comments, but we just went through this across the street with Bay Ridge Park, and what they did is a group of them got together. They had their own little, almost like a board type meeting, community meeting, and they listed their comments that they all agreed on, and each person just emailed me either a copy of it, put in their email, or a PDF of that letter, and put it that way. And then we also had a handful of people who had additional comments as well and sent those in. So there's a few different ways.
Thank you. You started out, and I wrote down the first thing you said, there is potential for future risk. Could you elaborate on what you were alluding to?
Yeah. So that's something we had touched on with in the risk assessment. So we take conservative assumptions. We look at the soil gas results, and we assume that the building foundation is going to degrade over time, that there's the potential if a home is remodeled and the pressure inside the building changes, it can influence vapor intrusion. It can prevent vapor intrusion from occurring, but it can also increase vapor intrusion. So we take that into consideration when looking at does mitigation or remediation, is it really necessary? And that future risk helps give us some risk numbers to go off of to help us make our risk management decisions. It doesn't mean that it will happen, but it is something we do want to consider.
Okay. I also want to remind people that a copy of the fact sheet is in your handout tonight.
Okay, hi there. This question is maybe for Mike, I think. Is based on your experience with Bay Ridge Park and other locations, what is your level of confidence that this process will work? That's question 1.
So the remedial process, it's hard to say because we haven't started yet in Bay Ridge Park. So they're slightly ahead of you in the schedule. We will likely turn on their SVE system sometime in, I think, July. Is that right? July of 2022. And in that first 3 to 6 month period is where we'll determine the effectiveness of the system. Now, the SVE pilot test, which we actually conducted within their community, did show that we had a radial influence, meaning that we were able to pull contamination from 70 feet around each well, but we weren't able to pull a lot of mass, meaning we weren't able to pull a lot of the contamination out of the ground simply because the concentrations just aren't that high in this area. So the evaluation that we conducted with the SVE pilot test told us that this remedial alternative is acceptable and can work. It's feasible. How successful it is will be determined within that first 3 to 6 months.
Okay, so the process itself will take approximately 12 months from
Correct.
flipping it on. Now, what happens after the 12 months it doesn't work? And we're back to square one.
Right. No, so that's where that remedial alternative includes that subslab depressurization. So if the SVE just is not effective at reducing mass, which we know it's going to pull some out, and where the subslab depressurization would come into account is if we're still seeing concentrations from below the ground getting into homes. If that is happening, that's where we would go to that subslab depressurization system and ask for it to do that.
Just and maybe a basic question, this is kind of new for us, but on the alternatives that you said were not considered the enhanced HVAC and air purifiers, I understand the air purifiers are noisy, but if there are different concentration levels in different areas of the community, does it short term, but does it not provide any benefits?
No,
even if
it's-
it's a belt suspenders type benefit?
It's definitely beneficial, and it is being used for the purposes of a like actual cleanup plan and for a longer term solution. That's what we were saying was not acceptable. So they are being used in the short term. So any homes that have had vapor intrusion identified, they've been offered indoor air purifiers. Some have kept them, some have accepted them and returned them, and some have just straight up said, no, we're good. We're fine. And so.
But those air purifiers also were shown to be effective in
Yeah.
lowering concentrations below the ESLs. But one thing is we don't really have control of those air purifiers, right? We don't know if people run them on high. We don't know if they run them 24 hours a day. They are a nuisance. They are loud, and the same can be said with enhancing HVAC systems. It's more effective and more feasible for us to have more control of the system from the outside and to account by using SVE.
And so that was one of the comments that the water board had made was we want to address the vapor intrusion from below the ground and not rely on these controls that may not, if not operated to the optimal standards, won't effectively reduce the concentrations to levels that we want them reduced to.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify, when I say we want control, I mean the board, Ford, and Wood, not just Ford.
Okay, thank you.
Other comments from people or
I
questions?
think there's one up here.
Oh, thank you.
Is this going to help get the air problem out of our home? Because I couldn't stand the air purifiers, and I was told I have quite a bit of a problem. So, I don't know.
Yeah, if
Could you repeat the question?
Well, we had air purifiers in our home because they told us we had a problem, but I couldn't handle the noise. My husband couldn't handle the noise.
And so her original question was, is this going to solve the problem, basically? Is the SVE system going to mitigate the problem?
yes, and that's the idea. It should. That's why we're selecting soil vapor extraction as the first option, and it's to remove that mass that was creating it.
I'm going to make you do it. I am.
What is the health implication with this situation?
So the main contaminant that we're looking at is TCE, it's trichloroethylene, and that particular chemical has both long-term and short-term health effects. The short-term is at higher concentrations, and have we seen it here? I think there was one location that had it right at that, and that one, the short-term health effect has the potential to affect the heart of a developing fetus in a pregnant woman during her first trimester. There are, I will say, about 50-50 on studies that support those findings and that don't. So out of an abundance of caution,
I
the
don't
U.S.
think that's a problem in this area.
Hey,
You never know.
Right, and so that is one of the concerns, and so we do take that into consideration. And so the US EPA has these action levels, and they're a little higher. And then there's the screening levels that look at the longer term health effects. And the screening level, what is considered acceptable risk, is less than a 1 in a million increased risk of developing cancer or having adverse non-cancer health effects. And that's a hazard quotient of 1 that they use. But they look at that, and it's over. The assumptions that are used for the modeling is you're in your home 24 hours a day, 24 hours a day, 350 days out of a year over a 26-year exposure period, all at that, and then there's the increased risk. So they're pretty, it's fairly low, but it's at the point where when it's indoor air and it's what you're directly breathing, the water board doesn't find that acceptable, and we want to address it. When it comes to the future risk and looking at like worst case scenario, not what's in your home, we increase that the hazard risk, the cancer risk and stuff, and take that into consideration because you're not directly exposed.
Somebody over here.
I understand we have 54 units here at Belcourt Terrace. Of those, how many have participated in the monitoring?
You know what? Oh, stump the panel.
About?
Wasn't it like 34?
Yeah,
I
would
feel
say
like
a little
it's
greater than half.
About half. And
39.
Out of that, you found 3 homes
Correct.
that had levels above the acceptable level.
And just to clarify, there are a couple of homes on the northeast corner that are not part of our investigation area because they're outside of the soil gas plume. So of the 56 properties within this area, I think, I don't know, there's like 52 or something that are in the indoor air investigation area. And of those, we've sampled something like, what did you, 39? So.
And what do you think statistically, the 3 out of the 39, is that a high level, low level, except from studies that you normally do?
I would say based on the subsurface concentrations that we're seeing, that's about normal. I mean,
And I'll say that's also why it's so important for the testing, because there isn't a one size kind of fits all, and we can't make the assumptions of soil gas concentrations are at this level, that means there will be vapor intrusion occurring. We've seen vapor intrusion occurring at this home and not occur at the home next door. So it is, there's different variables, and sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's not. And so that's one why we encourage, if your home hasn't been tested, get it tested. And then when we do move into the longer term indoor air monitoring, which can occur with a frequency anywhere from every 6 months to once every 5 years, we're gonna, really encourage folks to participate in that, just so we can see if there are changes, because that's gonna help us also determine long term, is that future risk happening or not? And so it'll just give us more data to support our decisions.
Those 3 homes were contiguous?
2 of the 3 were.
And does it matter if you leave your windows open? I mean, we talk about indoor air quality, and then,
Yeah.
we pretty much get a breeze every afternoon.
So
that's
leaving,
gonna mitigate
it does.
concentration.
Leaving your windows open is the best way to clean your indoor air. And there's so many indoor air sources, anyways, that things that just naturally off gas, that opening your windows and just having the general ventilation is very good for indoor air quality, and is one of the more recommended approaches for at least short term and stuff.
I don't want to take any more time, but on your slide 14, with the proposed soil vapor extraction layout, you've got a lot of green lines and dotted lines. And can you explain what that means? Is that like where the vapor is migrating to or concentrated in?
Right. Yeah, I know. There's a lot of
Explanation.
there's a lot of detail on there. So those green lines are the concentration lines. So when they get the soil gas results, based on those numbers, they draw the contour lines to help us identify the shape and extent of the soil gas plume. So that's what those mean.
If you take a magnifying glass, you can see that on the green lines, there's actually a very small number. So there's one that says 10,000, there's one that says 1,000, and one that says 240. And so you can see that the 10,000 is obviously the highest concentration, and that's sort of focused on that southwest corner, and then it decreases as you move out.
Other questions?
Should we move?
Oh, the question is, should we move?
It's so pretty here. The weather is fabulous.
Okay.
If you don't want to, don't move.
Let me come back to the question I've asked each time that we've met, which is about what is the liability to Ford? I assume they're the ultimate liability, or their insurer is the ultimate liability holder. And we talked recently that someone in here tried to sell their home and it fell out of escrow because it became known to the new buyer and their realtor that this was occurring. You've been up at Bayview. Is there any insight you can give us about legal real estate issues that we should at least be aware of?
So I have not heard of any legal or real estate issues at this point. And historically, over the course of this investigation, I have heard of homes going up for sale. I've heard them fall out of escrow. I've heard them sell above asking price. I've heard them sell below asking price. They have gone, to me, as a geologist, I must clarify, I am a geologist and not a real estate expert or a real estate attorney. But it seems that the just general volatility of the market has just been normal even in this area. And I've heard a number of people buying homes that have had indoor air testing done and just gotten additional information and happily bought them.
Other questions? I'm gonna mosey down here. Questions? How about, I'm gonna just give you folks a minute to think about questions you may have. Does anybody, be okay with going to public? Yeah, okay. So I think at this time, since we answered all the questions, we'd like to just get your input. If you have input that you want to give verbally on the plan, you like it, you don't like the location, you're worried about noise, this is the time to do it. You can either write it on the card and give it to us. You can talk into the mic, and we're recording that, and that would, again, make its way into the response to comments document. So that's the formal input you're giving Jessica and the Water Board on this plan. Alternatively, the public comment period runs through October 14th. You're able to email Jessica comments, or if you're very old school, you can write them and put a stamp on the the envelope. I don't think we see much of that anymore. And the address again is in the packet that you got, and also in the fact sheet. So if you do have public input, if you do have input, we'd love to hear it. That's really why we're here tonight. So I'll give you a moment, and if you raise your hand, I'll number you off, and you can give us your input.
And I'll also say, I know this is a lot of information. It's a lot of technical stuff. So as you guys go home with the slides and stuff and something comes to mind later, please reach out. It can be an official comment to this, or it can just be a follow-up question. And you can email me, Mike, Daniela, email us all at the same time. And we will be happy to provide any kind of clarifying answers if you have them. Because we want to make sure you guys are, aware of what's going on and all of your questions have been addressed.
Thank you.
Sure.
Going backwards a little bit, the 9-foot building, is that a forever building, or when would that go away? Or do we have any idea when that would go away?
So the idea would be that the soil vapor extraction treatment system would run for about 12 months. I can't promise that the building will go away after 12 months because generally we turn off the system and see how the ground responds. There's often like a rebound, and then it may rebound such that we want to turn it back on occasionally again. So it would have to be evaluated at that time, but the goal is not to have that building there forever. When we get to a point where we can kind of walk away from the system and say we've cleaned it up, we're good, that system will get removed.
And I want to kind of add on to that. For them to remove this system, that is something that does require water board approval, because we're going to say, yep, you're done remediating. So that's something they will submit in a report after looking at, are the concentrations increasing, staying the same, still decreasing. We want all of that analytical data from these probes that are in the community. We want to know what's happening before we make any permanent decisions on removing that structure.
No, a question. Sorry.
No problem at all.
Is the plume still moving?
It depends on where It depends on what probe you're looking at. And I will say in a couple of areas, when I last looked, there's a couple locations, and I don't know exactly where right now off the top of my head, but that have increasing concentrations. There's not much, and most of them at the plume boundaries, what I have seen, where the green line ends and that, you know, green shading goes, you'll notice some of that green shading does not have a green line in it. It's like further in because the plume has been decreasing at the boundaries, which is great. That's something I've noticed in
Yeah.
general. I haven't seen it shifting like further and spreading this way more or anything like that. So that's
And
favorable.
typically these plumes breathe, right? They'll get larger and smaller for the most part, but as far as our lateral delineation of the plume, we have a pretty firm understanding of it.
And is it going southwest?
I wouldn't say it's moving in any direction other than, no, not in any specific direction.
Yeah.
Okay. Questions, input?
Then we can.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Oh,
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for coming out.
I'm
This was
glad-
a really good
yeah.
turnout tonight.
Thank you.
I would just like to remind folks, you have till October 14th, and we will be sending out, if you comment or send comments in, we'll be sending you a response to comments. I think it's fair to say that we'll be sending the response to comments to the HOA board as well, and we can share it with anybody else. Okay?
And then we'll hang out for, you know, as much time as you guys need afterwards to answer any like questions one-on-one if you'd like.